Good morning. It's nice to see you all here today. So Zazen is sometimes described as sitting still and letting go of thoughts. It sounds easy, but it's actually not. It's actually not easy. Um, like most everything else, it takes some practice. And if you're relatively new to it, I would suggest, giving it 5 minutes a day practice at the time of day when you feel most calm, which to me is the early morning time. So it takes practice. And I think the advantage of being in a room with others, the huge advantage is that there's all this peer pressure to sit still, not move, because everybody else is trying to sit still, not move. It's more difficult on one's own, but possible. It takes practice. So we've been the last few weeks sort of traveling down the Eightfold Path. And last week we had a lively discussion about right speech, samavaka. And the next stop is right action, sama kamanta. Kamanta coming from the same root as kama or karma, just intentional action. And we've discussed the various ways to interpret this sama, this right. But I recently encountered an analogy that the Buddha makes about what right means. And he said that if you were trying to produce oil and you put some gravel in a tub and sprinkled it with water, and then you pressed it and sprinkled it with more water and pressed it and sprinkled it with more water and pressed it, you wouldn't get oil. But if you put sesame seeds in a tub and sprinkle it with water, press it, sprinkle it with water, press it, keep doing that over and over, eventually you can extract sesame oil. So really the right has to do with what's effective, what works towards the end of mitigating suffering or distress or pain for oneself and others. So, right action. The Buddha defines right action as in 3 parts. One is abstaining from taking life. The second is abstaining from stealing, taking what is not given. The third is abstaining from sexual misconduct. And for monastics, this would be celibacy. For lay people, it's otherwise, but sexual misconduct, abstaining from that. So, as with the rest of the Buddha's teachings, it's intended to be received and used. So how do we receive and use this teaching of right action? Well, in some ways, it sounds like kind of a low bar. I mean, you can get to the end of the day and say, well, I haven't killed anyone. I haven't stolen anything. I haven't molested anyone. I'm good. Check, check, check. And on some level, at some stages, that might be useful. But for many people, that doesn't take you too far. But as with the rest of the Buddha's teachings, there are layers of depth. As Rosan Yoshida says, there is no limit to the depth of the Dharma. So, as it turns out, this abstaining from killing, according to the Buddha, includes not only people, it includes all living beings, all sentient beings. And there is some controversy in some sectors about whether insects qualify. But traditionally, insects do qualify. They seem to have their wants and needs, and to have their intentions frustrated just like we do at times. So in our modern American life, we're somewhat insulated from killing. We're somewhat insulated from the cycle of birth and death, isolated from it. At the grocery store, there are the pork chops and drumsticks that are all arranged on a styrofoam tray encased in plastic with a label on them that might have a barbecue recipe. The actual killing, though, occurs far away in remote places, in remote, relatively heavily guarded places where visitors are not welcome, especially journalists. So we don't witness, we don't see the killing. But it takes place. Even in our sort of staid inner suburb neighborhood here in Overland, there is a cycle of birth and death that, if you witness it, you can see. We had a robin's nest in our holly bush in the spring with 3 eggs in it, and we observed the eggs hatch and the parent robins tending the nest, and then we observed the little fuzzy robins turn into what were starting to look like birds 2 weeks later. Very rapid transformation. And then suddenly one morning, there was only one bird left, and it was mutilated. The others were gone. So some predator, we don't know what predator, but some predator had visited during the night. And then the other day Carol and I were in the front room and looked out the window, and Carol noticed a fox. We have a red fox in our neighborhood, just trotting along the road. We've seen it a number of times, trotting there. But all of a sudden, it changed course and went running across the road toward our yard faster than anything I've ever seen. And almost simultaneously, a squirrel that was under the Japanese maple tree went flying up the branches into the upper reaches of the tree. And the fox arrived there just split second too late, sort of put its paws up as high as it could reach in the tree, but obviously couldn't climb a tree, so had to go away hungry. But there is this cycle of birth and death all around us that we are relatively insulated from. So there are the pork chops, but you might say, but hey, wait, I'm a vegetarian. I don't eat pork chops. Well, recently I've been reading 2 books by naturalists. One of them by Drew Lanham, who is a contemporary naturalist. He's on the faculty at Clemson University, and he wrote a book called Home Place about his native South Carolina, making just acute observations about the land, the plants, the wildlife, the flora and fauna of his home place. And he made repeated reference to an Aldo Leopold, who was a naturalist around the first half of the 20th century, who has influenced many subsequent generations of ecologists. And Aldo Leopold wrote about his farm in Sand County, Wisconsin. So I'd like to just share the screen a minute, if this works. And so I was struck that both of these authors, who showed such obvious love for plants and animals and wildlife, would both in their books have a little section on when they went deer hunting. I mean, how could you bear to kill such a elegant creature as a deer if you had that sensitivity to wildness and wilderness? So Aldo writes, I have lived to see state after state extirpate its wolves. I have watched the face of many a newly wolfless mountain. I have seen every edible bush and seedling browsed, first to anemic desuetude, and then to death. I have seen every edible tree defoliated to the height of a saddle horn. In the end, the starved bones of the hoped-for deer herd, dead of its own too much, bleach with the bones of the dead sage or molder under the high-lined junipers. And he says, I now suspect that just as deer herds live in mortal fear of the wolves, so does a mountain live in mortal fear of its deer. And perhaps with better cause, for while a buck pulled down by wolves can be replaced in 2 or 3 years, a range pulled down by too many deer may fail replacement in as many decades. He concludes the chapter, we all strive for safety, prosperity, comfort, long life, and dullness. But too much safety seems to yield only danger in the long run. He's referring to exterminating the wolf population to protect cows and humans. And Drew Lanham, who describes himself as a black birder, in talking about his deer hunt. And it's not like he hunted a lot of deer, but he did describe shooting this buck and using the meat from it, which was quite a few pounds, for 2.5 years to feed his family. And he says, well, many vegetarians claim that their heads lie easier at night, knowing that they've inflicted no killing or suffering. But the soybeans that yield tofu have to grow somewhere, and it's not all in hydroponic solar-powered hothouses. No, the neat and tidy rows of soybeans and the amber waves of grain grow in fields that used to be wildlife habitat. These crops do indeed bear the blood, but differently. In altered habitat, displaced wildlife, chemical runoff, transportation costs, greenhouse gases emitted in food conversion, the ethics of food are never uncomplicated. The ethics of food are never uncomplicated. And I guess I'm not trying to stimulate, a heated discussion here about whether people should be vegetarians or vegans or not. That's not totally beside the point, but it's not the point I'm wanting to make. But just to make the point that as you go down through the layers of depth in thinking about abstaining from killing, it gets complicated. The Buddha was fairly clear, however, about this point. He said, laying aside violence toward all living creatures, both the firm and unfirm in the world, one should not kill a living being, not have it killed, not condone killing it by others. So how do we receive and use these guidances from the Buddha to abstain from killing, abstain from stealing and sexual misconduct? And I've kind of focused on killing as an example, but you could generate similar thoughts about the other two. Well, I think on one level, you can take it as a sort of seal of good housekeeping to, if you haven't killed, haven't stolen, and haven't molested anyone today. But I don't think that's giving the teaching its full due. I think there are all different kinds of layers to consider, all different kinds of killing, all different kinds of stealing. all different kinds of misconduct. Some people prefer to express these more positively, and I think that's just a temperamental difference. It's all right. Some people would say, instead of abstain from killing, would say to nurture life, to nurture living things. Or instead of saying abstain from stealing, they might word it to be generous, to be giving. And instead of saying abstain from sexual misconduct, to say promote the respect of other people's bodies. So I think these teachings are not so much to, pat yourself on the back at the end of the day if you haven't committed some crime, but to remind you, to carry them with you as a reminder, as a guide, especially in this very complex, interconnected world we live in, to do as little harm as possible, to try not to harm living things. So I'll end with a poem of the Buddha. He says, "Let creatures all things that live, all beings of whatever kind, see nothing that will bode them ill. May not of evil come to them." So we'll stop there and see what thoughts people might have about right action, or any other thoughts about meditation, or anything else that people may wonder about. Thank you.